everyone, my name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we're going to be discussing limits and how to expand them the right way, as well as the wrong ways to avoid. We'll also discuss why you might want to expand your own limits, why somebody might want to push your limits for you, the good, the bad, the ugly, the psychological background. All of that are going to be things that we discuss here in this video, so let's go ahead and get into it. I think first, as a baseline, we should establish what limits are. So limits and boundaries are things that we have in the BDSM community to sort of help us set up barriers around the relationship and really define what is okay versus what is not okay. With limits, you have two broad categories. The first would be soft limits. Soft limits are things that you may want to explore at some point in the future that you're not really sure if you are comfortable or that you enjoy or not yet. It might also be things that you only like to do under very particular circumstances or only with particular people, rather than something that you enjoy more generally. And by contrast, we also have hard limits. Hard limits are things that are absolute no-goes. You never want to do them under any circumstances with anybody ever. Just don't even go there. Hard limits are just not something that you are really interested in changing or exploring. However, there can be fluidity within limits. It's not always entirely set in stone. Soft limits with time, exploration, and so on may become hard limits. Things that used to be hard limits may become soft limits. And things that are soft limits may eventually not become limits at all, which is really what we're going to be talking about here in this video. Now, boundaries, by contrast, tend to be more generalized. They tend to be more about the relationship as a whole, whereas limits are more about like individual scene activities, things like doing water sports or flogging or wearing a gag or being called a particular word or phrase during a scene. Boundaries are more things like not doing BDSM with coworkers or not doing public displays of affection, just more generalized and more about sort of the wider landscape of the relationship. And these two things work together to help you create and establish sort of what's okay and what's not okay for that relationship. Now, of course, the next question would be, two together, how do you know what your limits are and how do you establish them? So I have lots of other videos where I've talked about this, so I'll just be brief. I really think with anything in BDSM, having a process of introspection first will lead you to the most honest answer. So before you even talk to a partner or anything else, really kind of sit with yourself and think to yourself, what do I feel comfortable with and what do I not feel so comfortable with? And if you are not really sure where you land, if it could be like either way, I would err on the side of caution and say, you know what, I'm going to wait until I have more information first. You can also work with a partner. Maybe you're in an established relationship already, you're in like a vanilla pairing and you're getting into BDSM together. Maybe you work together to kind of discover what your limits are for the relationship as sort of a collaborative experience where as you're doing BDSM, you sort of figure it out as you go along where those boundaries are. And that's a little bit more risky, especially if you're kind of going in the framework of like, oh, we're going to try it and assume we like it instead of coming from a place of caution, but some people do it that way. And generally, the more experience you have in BDSM in terms of time in the scene, number of scenes that you do, reading books, going to classes, just being around a dungeon BDSM community environment, the more you're really going to have a solid understanding of where your limits are. And it is perfectly okay if they change over time, even quite drastically, because you're not always going to know everything up front about exactly where your limits are. Now, regardless of how you kind of discover where your limits are, you may have a scenario where you just have sort of a blanket list of like, these are my limits that you have independently of your partners. It's just sort of like, these are my limits. There they are, just existing on their own. Or you might have something where you have more customized limits that are unique to each individual partner that you have, that you kind of create alongside the development of the relationship. But regardless of the framework that you have for your limits, how you find them, all of that stuff, it should be something that you discuss as part of the negotiation process. It should be brought up as soon as possible when it is relevant. Now, a big note here, because some people get confused about this. Limits and boundaries are not just for submissive partners. Dominants and tops can and absolutely should have their own limits and boundaries as well, and both sides should discuss what those are for them during the negotiation process. Now, of course, if you're in some kind of like MS, TPE, power exchange relationship, your experience, your framework around limits may be different than what I am discussing here, but that kind of high level power exchange isn't really what I'm talking about in this video, so just keep that in mind. So firstly, let us discuss people that want to push your limits, because although limits should be something that are mutually respected and talked about before you do a scene or before you establish a power exchange relationship, some people really feel entitled to like kind of just see if they can change those edges a little bit. So sometimes you will have people like the very stereotypical online dom type who will be like, real submissives don't have limits. Real slaves never have any boundaries. Or they act like having a dominant is something where like, oh, well, you're like, your dominant is supposed to like set your limits for you, or your master is supposed to help you decide what your limits are. And again, this goes back to what I just mentioned about like having that introspection first and knowing for yourself where your limits and boundaries are, and not letting somebody just like push that around because they can, because they're just some random person online. So be aware, some people will try to just like maliciously tell you where your limits should be for their own gain. Now, even if somebody's approach to limits isn't that conspicuously malicious, there are still, especially D types, that think for some reason that like particular limits are silly and like therefore don't need to be respected. So for example, you might have a D type that's thinking to themselves, oh well, like I know this person I negotiated with said that gags or hair pulling was a hard limit for them, and like I just think that's really silly because every submissive I've ever played with loves spanking. They just haven't done it the right way yet. And so like in the middle of a scene, they'll like try to do it because they're not taking the limit seriously enough to believe that it truly needs to be respected, because oh my gosh, everybody loves this, or everybody should love it, and it's ridiculous that you have a limit around that. And no, big red flag. It doesn't matter how silly a limit is or how unusual it seems. A limit is a limit is a limit. And if somebody told you to not do something during a scene and then you do it anyways, that is a consent violation. You don't get to violate somebody's consent because you arbitrarily decide that it should be something that you're allowed to do. That is not how consent works. And if you do happen to think that somebody's limits or boundaries are weird or don't make sense or are pointless, it is not your prerogative to force the limit on them during a scene or during their relationship. It should be instead that you just realize that you're probably not really that compatible and then just move on for both of your sakes. Now, you can also have people that genuinely, honestly believe that pushing limits and boundaries are part of what you do in a power exchange relationship. That part of the role of being a dominant means that you are a safe haven from which a submissive can explore the edges of the things that they're comfortable with somebody that they know and trust. That it is a huge sign of devotion and respect and trust in the relationship to be able to continually grow and explore more and more things with that partner you're doing power exchange with. And this can also definitely come from a place where you have a very real desire to help a partner work through things that make them afraid, that they're scared of, and help show them that it doesn't have to quite be so scary. However, this is not always from quite so a wholesome place of like really, really wanting the best for your partner. It can also be from basically a more mature, refined version of the online dom thing where it's like, well, because I'm a dom, I get to mold any submissive to be anything that I want, and you're not allowed to have water sports be a limit for you because it's a thing that I'm really, really into, and as a dom, that means I should always get everything that I want no matter the circumstances, rather than having it be something that is a mutually beneficial, mutually focused thing that you are both really thinking about both partners' needs and wants in that relationship versus just using power exchange as a way to bulldoze through your partner's limits and make them whatever it is that you want them to be in a very selfish way, as opposed to doing it because that's what both of you ultimately want. And I know from personal experience as well that amongst doms, there can almost be this kind of competition, and it's not between themselves, but between their partners. And I'll never forget this. I think like the second or the third time I ever went to a dungeon, I overheard this conversation where a bunch of doms, like 4 or 5 of them, were in this group, and they were all talking to each other about how one of them had finally been able to push past a partner's particular limit and get them to red during a scene. Like, that was like a good thing. And that always really, really stuck with me because it seems to be that for some dominants, having a submissive partner that is willing to do anything for them is almost this bragging right that they want to be able to obtain to compare themselves favorably to other dominants around them, that it's like a sign of their true masculinity and like domly domness that they have the submissive that would literally crawl through glass if they told them to, regardless of where that person's boundaries and comfort level actually is. And I can't believe I have to say this, but treating your actual real human partner as a trophy for your masculinity and to assure your ego and dominance is not a good thing and should not be how we treat partners. And at minimum, it typically does not have good long-term outcomes for the relationship and is not how you build a sustainable long-term power exchange dynamic. Now, I've said all of this stuff, but of course, it's not always just other people that want to push limits. You might yourself want to kind of expand your own limits. It might be because you want to overcome a long-term phobia that you have, or simply because you want to be able to explore new sensations, or because you want to be able to develop the really deep trust relationship that would be necessary to do so with your partner. Now, this could also definitely come from things like community pressure, not feeling submissive enough because of where your boundaries are at, or wanting to prove something to somebody else, such as impressing a dominant that you want to be in a relationship with. However, really, really be cautious when you are examining your own motivations for why you might want to expand or change your limits. Is it because you have a genuine desire all on your own to just explore more and have that positive relationship with your limitations, with your limits, wherever they happen to be, versus feeling pressured that you need to change them for somebody else to impress the community or feel like somehow that is what's going to make you a worthy submissive? Because if your motivation is in that latter category and you are feeling pressured to change your limits because of how you think that affects your status in the community or how other people think of you, that is not a good place to be at when it comes to changing your limits. It is okay for your limits to be at whatever they are at, whether that be limitations around things that are seemingly really common in BDSM, like spanking or using gags, or things that are more extreme and complex, like suspension rope bondage or needle play. You are allowed to not like things. You are allowed to not like whatever the hot new trend is on kinky TikTok. Being true to yourself and your needs, whatever they happen to be, wherever they are, will get you so much farther in your kink relationship than trying to pretend to be something you're not and that you're comfortable with things that you're not really comfortable with. And now that we have talked about all of that, how do you actually go through the process of changing your limits? And I think first, we should cover all of the wrong ways to do it, because there are a lot of areas where you may mess up this process if you're not careful in the way that you go about it. Number one would be, don't start pushing limits without talking about it first, and definitely don't do it with somebody that you would already know would respect your boundaries anyway. Pushing limits plus pickup play equal bad idea. Number two is, don't renegotiate in the middle of a scene for something that is typically a limit. Whether you are a dom or a sub, top space, subspace, basically make it so your brain is on drugs, and that is a really bad time to be trying to make rational choices about something that's going to affect you mentally, probably for a very long time. So in the middle of a scene is generally not the best time to start playing around with things that you've never really talked about doing before. Now, of course, everybody's individual reactions to BDSM play, individual brain chemistry is going to be different. I do know some people that do renegotiate mid-scene with partners they know that they've played with before. However, that should be something that you discuss up front, and that still doesn't make it an ideal time to bring up something that is typically a limit. Number three is, do not plan for a long, intricate scene the first time that you introduce a limit where the only thing you focus on is just that limit. Also, do not try to stack together pushing multiple limits at the same time. And number four, please, for the love of God, do not start pushing limits because you think it's a fun, bratty thing to do. Do not look at limits like this fun, shiny button you get to push to like annoy your partner or something. Please treat limits seriously and with respect, because that is how they should be treated. Limits are not jars full of rupees to be smashed open like you're playing a Zelda game. They are delicate combinations of things about our inner psyche, our fears, and the way that we see ourselves that can be quite complex to play with, and they should be treated as the delicate things that they are. Now that we've talked about the wrong way to push limits and all of the various motivations that can go into why limits might be changing, let us talk about the techniques that you can use for changing limits the right way. Number one, I think the first thing you have to do from the very beginning is understand the motivation for why you want a limit to change. Again, going back to the earlier conversation here, do you want to change it because of community pressure, because you want to impress other doms? Do you want to change limits because you want to get over a phobia, because you want your submissive partner to be able to explore fears that they have in a safe way? What is really the reason behind why you want this limit to no longer be a limit? Also, I think it's a really good idea to understand the background behind why that limit is a limit. Is it coming from a place of lack of knowledge and experience about the thing? Is it because you have some sort of underlying assumption about the play, what it means about your relationship? Is it based on some kind of legitimate psychological phobia? Is it because of some sort of fear of how risky the type of play seems to be? Or is it possibly related to trauma triggers or past abuse? Once you have come to understand the motivations behind expanding the limit, as well as the background information for why it's a limit, once you kind of know that it's something that you're comfortable kind of exploring further, I think the next step would be to address any lack of knowledge or education about the kind of play, because oftentimes limits, especially if you're newer to BDSM, if it's an area you've never explored before, the fact it's a limit might come from a lack of knowledge and fear that comes from that lack of knowledge about the scene, the play, the element, whatever it is. And so I think if you can do things like read about the type of play, watch videos about it, watch other people do the thing you want to do, watch your partner do a demonstration on themselves, go to a class about it. These are really good options to help make both parties more aware of exactly what this thing is and why people do it, why people enjoy it, and all of those things together can really help ease a lot of the fears before you go actually into the process of physically exploring it for the first time. And when it does come to exploring limits for the first time, my motto is, as always, to really, really go slowly. I would recommend a very gradual introduction. I would not recommend, again, doing a scene where the only thing that you do is the limit. I would recommend, if you can, depending on what it is, to really set up a scene that you know you would normally really enjoy, maybe some of your favorite elements that you know that you really like, and pair that together in very small doses with the limit. So let's say, for example, you have a limit around being called the word bitch in a scene, right? You really don't like it when your intimate partners call you the word bitch, but you want to try and experiment with it. So let's say you also really enjoy DDLG and like praise kink. So you would set up a scene where you have all of your favorite DDLG activities going on. You're getting lots of praise and love and affection, maybe almost to the point of it kind of being humiliating if you want to go in that direction with your praise kink. And maybe your partner would say something, "I love you, you dirty little bitch." And so it's being used in a positive way in the scene along with things that you know that you already like. And just having like just the one little tiny microscopic instance is enough to get a sense of like, "Ooh, this is actually going to be a hard limit for me and I cannot tolerate this." Or if it's something that you want to explore further. And when you are doing scenes like this, I would also recommend that no matter how small the scene is, really, really take your time to plan for aftercare, for debriefing after a scene, and please also space out these scenes. I would say give yourself, depending on if you live with your partner, you know, how often you guys can see each other for scenes, I would say at least like a week, if not 2 to 3 weeks before you do that thing again in a scene. Again, give your partner lots and lots of time to really, really sit with how this made them feel, what they liked about it, what they didn't like about it. Really, really give as much time as necessary to process and reflect. Definitely err on the side of caution there. And as you do this more often, you can shorten the time between the scenes. You can expand how much that element is in your scenes to kind of discover exactly where that comfort level is at, until eventually maybe it can stand on its own as a scene element and you feel comfortable with doing that. Now, even if something is not like a full-on soft limit anymore, you may discover that you have a certain tolerance level for it. So maybe you like it, but only with like certain other things paired with it, or only a certain amount during a scene, or only when it's with a particular partner. So maybe it doesn't actually even really stop being a soft limit, but it does expand. The times and the circumstances in which you can do the thing do get wider, so I would still count that as a success. And even if you do discover that like, no, actually this needs to stay exactly the way that it is, that is perfectly fine. It's about the knowledge and the process and learning, I think, more so than, you know, beating yourself up and feeling like a failure because you just can't get over this thing. You know, all of our psychologies are really unique and they should be treated that way. And it doesn't make it bad that you can't get over something. You really just need to be able to respect yourself wherever that happens to be at. And 2 last little tips that I have here would be, 1, if you are exploring limits, don't necessarily do the same scene every single time you're trying to see if you can expand the limit or not. Kind of mix it up a little bit. Try different energies. Try different scene elements. So for example, maybe you have a limit around gags. Gags, you might discover, feel really, really good when you're doing a sexual spanking scene. But maybe they don't feel so good when you combine it with, say, bondage or sensory deprivation. And also, if you are in a power exchange relationship, this is a great opportunity to use the tools that gives you. Things like rewards and positive reinforcements. I definitely think if you are going through the work of really trying to address a limit, that deserves an extra sticker on the sticker board. And that's really everything that I have to share with you guys today about the subject of pushing limits. If you guys have your own stories about this, your own comments, questions, suggestions, I would love to hear that from you all. You can go ahead and put it down in a comment in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. I make videos twice a week about all sorts of kink and BDSM related topics. And finally, if you really enjoyed this, if you want to support what I do, the best way you can do that is through Patreon. A link to that will be down in the description box below. We are currently working toward 1,000 patrons, and when we get to that goal, we will have a bunch of new exclusive perks and rewards for people on Patreon, just to thank everybody for getting to that amazing goal. So if you want to check that out, again, please do. Link to it will be down below. If you already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you guys next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.